Hi guys, my name is Emily. So this is a follow-up to my video on The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. This is part of the hashtag DGProject17, a reading project in which I am reading the Dark Tower series for the first time. Disclaimer, 1, I have never read the series before, so if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense because you've read the whole series, that is why. 2, I do not care about authorial intentions. I care about how this series fits in with my research interests. I'm interested in fantasy literature. I'm interested in how fantasy can be used to subvert. So I'm looking to see how the Dark Tower series fits or doesn't fit into fantasy literature and kind of tracing how it works out with other texts that influence it along the way. Let's talk about The Wastelands by Stephen King. So this is the third book in the Dark Tower series. It was published in 1991. The Drawing of Three was published in 1987. That's a pretty big gap for people reading this in real time. Like, it's a long time to wait for the next book. This was a fast-paced read for me. Like, whenever I picked it up, I flew through the sections, but it was really hard to get through in places. Like, there was a significant portion of the book that was just slow. Like, it was hard to get to the ending, and then once you get close to the ending, things super pick up and then end abruptly. So you spend a lot of time getting to know the characters, which is important. I think it was important to spend that time slowly getting to know more of the characters. It fleshes out a lot of the characters more. For instance, Eddie is not a character that I particularly enjoyed in the second book, but having spent more time with him in this book, I enjoy him a lot more. I am planning on doing a follow-up video talking about Odetta, Detta, and Susanna, so my opinion on her has slightly shifted, and I will share those thoughts sort of together in one video, so I'm not going to touch on Susanna here. Now, one of the things that I've sort of been tracking throughout is Roland, and how I don't particularly care for Roland as a fantasy hero. He's really not our stereotypical fantasy hero. I didn't super enjoy him as a character, just as a morally gray character. But I think now that I'm seeing more of him in these books, and we're learning more about Cait, all that jazz, like, the more we learn about this destiny and the world and his childhood and how he forms relationships with people, the more I come to, if not respect Roland, at least find him fascinating. And so many people have been telling me, like, once you get to the end, you'll want to go back to the gunslinger and you'll have a whole new appreciation for Roland in the series. I'm with you that my opinions are changing the more I learn. And I'm happy about that. I'm happy I've continued reading. The one thing that I think is worth noting is that I am finding this harder and harder to read as fantasy literature. So I started out under the impression that this was fantasy literature. It was Stephen King's sort of stab at fantasy. And the more I read for genre elements, the less I see it as a fantasy, which is perhaps exactly what I'm looking for, in that I was wanting to see how the text fits in the genre or subverts the genre. So initially, you kind of saw it as an immersive fantasy. In The Gunslinger, we're thrown right into Roland's world. We have to accept that things like oracles exist. In the second book, we see it as a portal fantasy, sort of a playing with a portal fantasy, in that Roland is moving from his fantasy space into our world to draw people to him for his quest. And I did talk about how that subversion works and how I found it interesting in my previous videos. Now we're back into, our immersive fantasy for the most part. We're set in this secondary world, the world that is not our own, but at the same time it is our world. It does appear to be a parallel to our world, very much in the way that the Child Roland fairy tale that I talked about in one of my initial videos is just sort of a half step off from the primary world. So we see a lot of technology that would exist in our world that exists in Midworld that is just sort of defunct and falling apart, and like grenades and trains and robotics that seem more advanced than we are even now in 2017. Like in 1990, when King was writing about this, would be very advanced, almost like it's slightly in the future of our world, which makes it feel more like sci-fi. Like, it still feels like sci-fi now. And I think that's one of the interesting things about genre. Science fiction and fantasy are fairly similar. Sci-fi seems to be forward-looking, and fantasy seems to be more backward-looking. So in fantasy, we're more likely to see swords and in sci-fi we're more likely to see like lasers. And that's a very simplified description, I know, but the idea that with the futuristic technology in Roland's world, it's pushing sci-fi, and I find that interesting. At the same time, many of the elements are so close to the writing that King does, the horror. There are two instances that I can think of that are just pure horror, pure messing with the reader's expectations and like psychologically disturbing things that very much fit into the horror genre. And of course we have the Western because Roland's a cowboy. It's a blending of genres, which is interesting, and it might make this series interesting moving forward because yes, I definitely still see fantasy elements, but so many questions, just so many questions, and I'm throwing that out there that it's doing interesting things with genre. And I guess my question now for myself is, does this series subvert the genre, or does this series attempt to sort of blend its own genre? So those are the thoughts that I'm going to leave you with for now. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on genre. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with a spoilery discussion video. Bye.